folks, Brian here for the Black Tux. Weddings should be memorable, but not for the groom's lack of style. Ain't that the truth? That's why our friends at the Black Tux design rental suits and tuxedos that you'll love wearing at your wedding. So if you end up getting featured on a list of 23 epic wedding fails, at least you'll know you look good for your close-up. But the best part about the Black Tux is that they have an easy online ordering process that brings your suit or tuxedo straight to you. That's pretty cool. Just pick a style at theblacktux.com and request a free home try-on so that you can feel the fit and quality before you commit. And if online isn't your style, they have showrooms all over the country where you can find your fit and play in your luck. From there, they'll ship your order 2 weeks before your wedding so you can check it one last time. Talk about commitment. Yeah, that's true. Over 5,000 five-star reviews across Wedding Wire, The Knot, and their own website agree. You won't find another rental experience or designs like the ones you'll find at the Black Tux. Grooms, if you want your wedding to be remembered for the right reasons, visit theblacktux.com/listen. That's theblacktux.com/listen for $20 off your purchase. Walk, don't run, be safe to theblacktux.com/listen to find a look for you and your crew. Thebblacktux.com, formal wear for the moment. I'm home.
This is the Confessions of an Arcade Addict podcast, an introspective look into video gaming from the classic era until today. Now here is your host, Brian.
Hey folks, what's going on out there? Brian here, and this is episode number 9 of the Confessions of an Arcade Addict podcast. I did a quick check through social media and emails. Still no correspondence coming my way, but that's okay. I'll keep plugging along as long as I can come up with topics to talk about. If you want to get a hold of the show, you can do so by dropping an email at arcadeaddictbrian, that's all one word, at gmail.com. Also, there is a phone number for voicemails. That is area code 734-743-2433. And also, as I've said, I have a social media footprint for this show. On Facebook, you just search for Confessions of an Arcade Addict. On Twitter, it's at arcadeaddict_B. On Instagram, it's arcadeaddictbrian. And on Tumblr, it is tumblr.com/blog/confessions of an arcade addict. So there are ways to get a hold of me, and I check them periodically. And if you send me some correspondence, I'll put it up on the show, and we'll talk about what you have messaged me about. So without any further ado, we've got a show to do, so let's do that, and we will go on to Arcade Rundown.
Good morning, Mr. Phelps. Your mission, Jim, should you decide to accept it, is to make Stefan believe Townsend's information. As always, should you or any of your IM force be caught or killed, the Secretary will disavow any knowledge of your actions. This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Good luck, Jim.
Arcade Rundown. Arnie's Place in Westport. Okay, this was an arcade that I used to go to infrequently because it was hard to get to. More often than not, I would go there with my friend Mark. Whenever he wanted to go to an arcade and I was tagging along with him, he had quite a few choices because, well, quite honestly, he had a car. We would go to Spanky's, we would go to Milford Rec, we would go to Gompers. Every once in a while, we would go to the arcade at the Connecticut Post Mall, and we would also go to Arnie's place. Arnie's place was, I should say, an arcade that was in Westport, Connecticut from 1982 until 1994. The owner was Arnie K, and he basically, from almost the day the arcade opened, he was fighting with the local townspeople, city council, those type of people from the moment he proposed to open the arcade. And that was more because, well, I'll just say it without trying to put too fine of a point on it. Westport is a rather hoity-toity town. A lot of people with money live out there. They certainly did when I was a kid. And they were just, they do as rich people do. They want their town a certain way, and they were against anything that could, how should I say this? Anything that could even bring an inkling of the quote unquote undesirable element. Um, Now, Arnie himself, from all reports, and I will get into an article in the New York Times about this a little bit later, but Arnie, basically what he wanted to do was open an arcade, and considering he was fighting, almost everyone there, and he didn't take a lot of guff from people apparently, because he threatened to open the place up to the Hells Angels, and threatened to turn the arcade into a pornographic theater, pretty much everything that the people living in Westport didn't want. But it was just a silly, ridiculous thing, and the arcade would probably still be going at least into the early 2000s. But by the time by the time 1994 came around, arcades were dying. Most of them were dead. I can certainly remember when I left Connecticut in 1993, all of the arcades I grew up with the exception of Milford Rec, um, and also the arcade in the Connecticut Post Mall, which got moved to another part of the mall. Those were like the only two dedicated arcades in the area. I do know that there's a place, I talked about it when I talked about Spanky's arcade. There was a place in further up the street from where Spanky's was that's called the Crazy Eights arcade, but that was a shell of an arcade. It was just a small storefront with maybe like 20 games, if I remember correctly, and that was just a sign of number one, the um, video games in general were moving more towards the home. It started with the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985, and it just kept going from there. 1994 was just before the PlayStation came out. I think the PlayStation came out in 1995. And when you have games that are at the very least close to the arcade experience, you're why would you go out to an arcade? Why would you try to get your parents to take you? Why would you, try to ride your bike there, or, try to get your friends together and go, things like that, when you could all just go over Mike's house or invite everybody over your house and just play games there. I mean, the Super Nintendo had a very strong stranglehold on the video game market at this time. The Genesis was right there with it in 1994, and the games themselves were just more of a motivation for people to stay home. So I can understand why he shut his arcade down in 1994. But so to describe the arcade itself, it was a wonderful place. It was great. I mean, I'll talk about it in more depth when I do my arcade review of Arnie's Place in a future episode. But I remember when I went there with Mark in, like, I think it was 1983, maybe 84. It was one of those 2 years. I know it was one of those two. But I remember walking this place and just being like in awe, but not in the way like in when I first went to Milford Rec, when I was in awe because of the sheer number of games. You know, when I first went to Milford Rec in like 1982 or 83, the sheer number of games just hit me upside the head. It was like video gaming heaven, nirvana, mecca, whatever term you want to use. In Arnie's Place, it was more just the ambiance of the place. I loved it. I mean, when you look at uh, my profile picture on Instagram or the profile picture on Anchor, from which this podcast is based, there's a picture. You see a picture of somebody playing a video game, and the video game cabinet itself is like in like a cubby hole, and it's lined with like incandescent light bulbs. That's Arnie's Place. I mean, it had this 60s, 1960s to 1970s Las Vegas casino feel. It was awesome. You know, each one, they had a wooden enclosure for the game to sit in, and each one had lights around lining it. It was fantastic. And it was just a great place to go. It was a certainly a change because it wasn't like the bare bones place of like Trumbull Mall Arcade. It wasn't quite like it was. It had a much more uh, had a much better experience than Spanky's did. Even though I love Spanky's to death, but it was lacking in some ways. Both places kind of hit you over the head with how many machines they had. I mean, Milford Rec had at least, I want to say at least 75 machines, maybe even as many as 100. And Spanky's had at least 50. Those were like the two biggest arcades around. And Arnie's was right there with them. I think they had at the height of their power, so to speak. I think in like 1983, 84, I think Arnie's had like 50 games. And but each one had that cabinet, and there was always music coming in from a rock station in Fairfield, if I'm remembering correctly. And it also had the kind of carpeting on the floor that you would find in a Las Vegas casino. The type where your foot kind of sinks in slightly. Sort of like, it sort of takes the exhaustion out of your legs, so to speak. Just kind of soaks it up. But I mean, I loved the place. It was fantastic. But the problem was is that I couldn't get to it anywhere near as often as I would like. In order for me to get there by myself, I'd have to take two buses out to Westport, and I would have to walk another, I'd say probably half a mile to a mile down US 1 to get there. And of course, if I'm using public transit, I'll have to make sure to catch probably the second to last bus heading back towards downtown Bridgeport, and then catch the number 8 going home. So my time there was limited. I probably could spend maybe 2 or 3 hours there, tops, before I'd have to turn around and go home. I rode my bike out there once or twice. I think once by myself, and then once with my high school friends, Rob, Dave, and Edgar. We all, Robert had a bike. I had to borrow one of Dave's bikes, and I think Edgar had a bike, and Dave had another bike. So we all basically got gathered together at Dave's house, and we would just ride down Fairfield Avenue until it joined up with the Post Road, and then we would just continue on to go through Fairfield and over to Westport. It took us about, I'd say, 25, 30 minutes to get there. But I have memories of that. I loved their selection of machines because they had pretty much everything from ranging from late 70s, early 80s, all the way up to the present day, whatever day that was, be it 82, 83, or 84. And it was just a great place to go when I could get there. But the problem was is that unless I had the ambition to ride my bike for an hour, heading back heading back home, or coming from my house going out to Westport, I'd have to go down all these back roads to kind of angle southwest towards Fairfield from where I lived, and it wasn't easy to get there. It's not like riding your bike in Florida where the roads are flat. It's mostly flat. No, where I lived in Connecticut, it was pretty hilly. So any hills you went down to get out there, you had to ride back up to get home. So it was kind of tough. But anyway, so yeah, let me read a little bit out of the New York Times article. Let's see. This is September 20th, 1994. New York Times article, which is kind of a big deal. Let's see. It says, for the first time in 12 years, Pac-Man and Turbo aren't working at Arnie's place. The arcade, which divided this wealthy suburb and led to repeated court battles, closed Sunday after customers played their last rounds of pinball, air hockey, and shoot-'em-up games like Revolution. In the end, Arnie K., the flamboyant owner, said he was worn out from his disputes with town officials. Quote, I've spent more than $1 million in legal fees fighting for my right to stay open, and we're not doing the business we used to do, he said. It's a combination of economics and disgust. I feel I've been harassed by the town long enough, and it's time to pack it in. Town officials, however, say that harassment went both ways. They recall Mr. K's threats to turn the arcade, located on the Post Road, that's US 1 for those who don't know, into a pornographic theater, and to let members of the Hells Angels take up residence there, as well as his refusal to comply with zoning regulations. Still, there is no nostalgia about the closing of the arcade, which Mr. K, 53 at the time, said was moving to Brewster, New York, about an hour away under new owners. I'm saddened that it's closing, said William Seiden, a former first selectman who opposed the arcade's opening and once had Mr. K arrested for trying to force his way into Mr. Seiden's office. Wow, Arnie was a firecracker. Apparently he didn't take crap from anybody. To continue, I made the mistake on the game room, no doubt about that, Mr. Seiden said. I thought it would be detrimental to the kids, but it wasn't. He ran it well, and it ended up being a big asset for the town. It became a good place for young people to play. Most town officials felt otherwise in 1982. And that's where I'll stop it there. Basically, I can kind of understand it, but yeah, reading this story, I can kind of understand how a man like him, would have problems with, residents and town officials, because considering how Westport was back in the 80s and 90s, and it hasn't gotten much better since then, at least not in my opinion. Sorry for anyone listening to this living in Westport, but you kind of know it's true. But anyway, those are my memories of Arnie's place. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, just get a hold of me at arcadeaddictbrian@gmail.com. Okay, with that done, we are going to move on to Are You Experienced?
I'm too old for this. Hiding in front seats like a teenager.
Poppy, I think I'm getting too old for this stuff.
I'm getting too old for this.
Listen, you was born too old for this.
I'm getting too old for this.
You're getting too old for this. Why?
Red arsed in the heather chasing other men's cattle.
I'm getting too old for this sort of thing.
Maybe we're getting too old for this. What do you think, huh?
I'm not too old for this shit. I'm not too old for this shit. You will not. We're not too old for this shit.
We're not too old for this shit.
We're not too old for this. Say it like you believe.
We're not too old for this shit.
Yeah.
We're not too old for
I'm
this
not gonna
shit.
buy a hemorrhoid cushion.
We're not too old for this shit.
Are you experienced? Donkey Kong. Like I've said with, let's go down the list. Space Invaders in 78, Asteroids and Galaxian in 79, Pac-Man in 1980. When Donkey Kong hit the arcade in 1981, people went nuts. They certainly did. When this game hit Trumbull Arcade, it was exactly like how the games I just mentioned really turned people on. I mean, it was like I've said, these are, without trying to be punny, game changers. What I mean by that is that games, when a game comes out and there's just such a rush and a mania to play it, that it basically just changes the video gaming landscape. And it seemed, going from 78, I'd say probably about 83 is when it kind of stopped. But from those 5 to 6 years in there was at least one game that sort of just revolutionized the gaming industry, and Donkey Kong was one of them. So, to give you a little information about it from Wikipedia, of course. See, the first game is a action platform game featuring Donkey Kong as the opponent in an industrial construction setting. Donkey Kong was released, of course, in 1981, and he faced Jumpman, later named Mario. And basically, Mario is trying to rescue his girlfriend Pauline from the clutches of Donkey Kong, a giant ape. It's sort of a cute version of King Kong in a way. And Donkey Kong was made by Shigeru Miyamoto, who is one of the legends of video game creation. I mean, if he's not above these people, he's certainly on a par with guys like Eugene Jarvis and Carol Shaw, who made River Raid, and people who were, again, revolutionaries of video gaming, whether it be on the home front or the arcade front. It kind of doesn't matter, at least not in my opinion. But he basically made Nintendo into a worldwide video gaming power, just on the strength of Donkey Kong. And it was just it was just crazy. Let's see. The original arcade Donkey Kong game was created when Shigeru Miyamoto was assigned by Nintendo to convert Radar Scope, a game that had been released to test audiences with poor results, into a game that would appeal more to Americans. The result was a major breakthrough for Nintendo and for the video game industry. Like I said, sales of the machine were brisk, with the game becoming one of the best-selling arcade machines of the early 1980s. The gameplay itself was a large improvement over other games of its time, and with the growing base of arcades to sell to, it was able to gain huge distribution. In the game, Jumpman, the character that would later become Mario, must ascend a construction site while avoiding obstacles such as barrels and fireballs to rescue Pauline, his girlfriend, from Donkey Kong. Both the Donkey Kong and its sequel, Donkey Kong Jr., were, like I said, just, how should I say it? They were so different from other games that came out. Most of the games that came out in the early 80s were space-based, most of them. I mean, there were other games like Pac-Man and things like that weren't like that, but that's where most companies were making games out of, because of the success of Star Wars in 1977, then The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, then Star Trek the Motion Picture in 1979. Those three movies kind of really shifted a lot of people's attention towards science fiction in those days. I know, I was there. Okay, but yeah, when this came out, everybody wanted to play it. Everyone. I remember walking the arcade, and I couldn't even get close to the Donkey Kong game unless I walked in the arcade right when it opened at like 9 o'clock in the morning. Just tons of people were there, and there were tons of quarters on the game bezel. Um, as I said, that was arcade etiquette back in the day. When someone was playing a game you wanted to play, you basically put a quarter on the bezel or somewhere near the start buttons or something like that, or on the junction where the screen and the control panel was, so that everyone knew that you were up next. And that's how it had to be, because when a lot of these games came out, a lot of people wanted to play them. I mean, I've already told a couple stories about how a couple of the rich kids that would frequent the arcade would just come in with, $10 and get it all in quarters, and hog the Missile Command machine or the Pac-Man machine all day, for a long time, until Carlo basically just would tell them, "Hey, you guys are hogging the machine. There are other people want to play this. Lay off." Things like that would happen. So, I mean, I loved it because it was one of those games that was always, wherever I went, arcade wise, almost every arcade that I went to back in the day had it. I mean, like I said, Trumbull Mall had it, Spanky's had it, Milford Rec certainly had it. Every arcade that I frequented in my childhood, there was a Donkey Kong machine there, and you would also see it in mom and pop grocery stores and bodegas and places like that, because that, like I said, that's a quick way to make money in the video gaming boom of the early 80s. So that game was around a lot. Um, the good thing about it is that you can find it almost everywhere. Uh, the the systems that had Donkey Kong ports, excuse me, systems that had Donkey Kong ports were the Atari 2600, ColecoVision, Amiga 500, Apple II, Atari 7800, Intellivision, the Commodore 64, Commodore VIC-20, uh, IBM PCs, the X Spectrum, Amstrad, the Atari 8-bit family, and so on and so forth. It was all over the place. I remember in 1983 there was uh, this huge ad campaign for I want to say it was like Atari games, because somehow some way they got the licensing for a lot of these games or something like that. I'd have to look at like a comic book, because that's where I would see it, on the backs of comic books, where they would say Donkey Kong is coming home or Frogger is coming home, and you would see like a kid sitting in, you'd see like 9 pictures of TV screens with the various video game systems of the particular game that they're advertising. They did this all over the place. It was crazy. But, that was how you knew you could find, Donkey Kong for the Intellivision or for the ColecoVision. Well, the the Donkey Kong actually came with the ColecoVision when it was released in 1982, which was huge, because up until that time there wasn't. If you wanted to play Donkey Kong, you had to play it um, in the arcade, and the problem is that I want to say maybe the Atari 2600 version came out, and I think the Intellivision version came out in 82 or 83, somewhere in there. But when the ColecoVision came out in 1982, people went crazy, because number one, that was the Donkey Kong was the game that came with the ColecoVision, but it was so close to the arcade, it was ridiculous. I mean, there's only like one major league difference between ColecoVision Donkey Kong and arcade Donkey Kong. One of the actual boards was missing. One of the actual screens. In the arcade version of Donkey Kong, there are four screens that you have to go through, and depending on what level you're playing at, and in the ColecoVision version, there were only three. That was the only major difference. But the graphics were so close to the original Donkey Kong, it was crazy, and that was the major selling point for ColecoVisions at first back in '82, because they didn't have a lot. They didn't have a ton of games. I think when the ColecoVision came out, I want to say they had like 8 games maybe, and then various manufacturers would start making games for the ColecoVision, and the library would just explode. But yeah, I mean, I will probably cover Donkey Kong in Time for Some Strategy, but I'm not going to go into the game mechanics right now. I'll just save that for another time. But the good thing about it is that if I want to play Donkey Kong, I can go to uh, the arcade in Brighton. They have a whole row of Donkey Kong machines. They've got the original Donkey Kong. They had 3 original cabinets at one point. I think they got rid of a couple. They had Junior Donkey Kong. They had Donkey Kong 3. They had the new releases of Donkey Kong that came out that are much more difficult than the original game. Both of them. They had Donkey Kong 2, as a matter of fact. It was, to see it. It was really impressive to see that in the arcade when I first started going there. That was one of the major that was one of the major points in that arcade's favor. But anyway, so yeah, I'll just stop it right here because I could probably go on about this for another hour, and it's already late. So anyway, those are my thoughts about Donkey Kong and my memories and so forth and so on. And if you have any to share, just get a hold of me at arcadeaddictbrian@gmail.com. Okay, from there, we shall go to home systems.
There's no place like home.
Hey guys, I'm going home.
Look, this is not a game, Mac.
Screw you guys, I'm going home.
Shall we play a game?
Love to.
Screw you guys, I'm going home.
Clear a path! I'm going home!
Home systems. The Atari 5200. Okay, I'm going to start this off by saying I got one of these for Christmas in 1983. The price for them had come down quite a bit from when they got released in '82 because they weren't exactly selling like hotcakes. Let's just put it that way. I'm just going to be honest about it. And I just remember begging my mother for a 5200, and my mother's like, "You already have an Atari. Why do you want this?" And I'm like, "Mom, the games are better. That's why I want it." And I think I did barely well enough in school at the time for her to purchase one. And so she did. And I immediately took it, put it in my room, brought it up into my room, hooked it up, turned it on, and started playing Pac-Man, and just playing it and playing it and playing it, because the reason why I wanted a 5200 was basically because of Pac-Man. Pac-Man for the 2600 came out in 1982, late 82, somewhere around this. I'll have to look it up later, but I think it came out sometime around this time. It was somewhere in 82, and this was one of the games, whether rightly, justly, or unjustly, this is one of the games that sort of started the domino effect for the video game crash of 1983, because what they put forward was nothing close to the arcade Pac-Man. I mean, they got away with it with Space Invaders because, you know, they did a good enough job with Space Invaders, and it was enough like the arcade Space Invaders that you could look at the differences and say, okay, no big deal. It's plays like Space Invaders. They may look different, and they still have the naming license, so that's okay. But Pac-Man was a maze game, and it looked like basically a prototype. You know, it just wasn't the same experience as Pac-Man. It just wasn't. And the funny part is that ever since Pac-Man, someone actually wrote a arcade translation of Pac-Man for the 2600, so it could have been done. But like I said, this was the one of the first steps towards the video game crash of '83. So that was one of the main reasons why I wanted a 5200 in the first place, is that I wanted an actual Pac-Man that I could play at home. I I remember renting Pac-Man from the Video Connection, and by the way, I will be talking about Video Connection in the very next episode. Stay tuned. And how important that place was. But I remember renting Pac-Man in 1982 and just not being very happy with it, not being very pleased with it. It could have been better than it was, but by this time in '82, Atari had such a stranglehold on the video game market that it's like I've said whenever I talk about the crash. It's my personal opinion. It may not even be concurrent with what actually happened, but I believe that part of what happened that caused the video game crash was corporate arrogance. That there were certain people at Atari who knew nothing about video games. Only thing they cared about was how many units a game system or a game sold, and it didn't matter what you put out as long as it sold 100,000 units. It didn't matter. And Atari had already had a falling out with a lot of their game creators, who went on to create Activision, and it was just something that it was just you could see the iceberg up ahead as far as video gaming went when it came to the cavalier attitude and the greed and the arrogance and the incompetence of people who were in charge of not only Atari but other video game manufacturers or companies. And you could see this coming right down the pipe. I think in E.T. and also I think it was the Earth World series. Those three games pretty much sort of signaled the beginning of the end or not the beginning of the end, but it certainly were indicators that a crash was coming. And but getting back to the 5200, when I got that game, I played it nonstop for a while, for a long time actually. I almost put my 2600 in storage because it was such a great version of Pac-Man that I couldn't put it down. But after a while, of course, by this time, I got so good at it that I got bored with it. And I used to have to go to a friend of mine, Damon, who lived down the street. He had a 5200, and I would borrow games from him, or I'd go to my cousin Matt, who lived a few houses down from me, and try to borrow games from him. Because I couldn't afford them because the games were more expensive, because it's basically an Atari 800 computer without the keyboard. That's basically what it is. and the games were exactly the same as um, games that were on the Atari 400 or 800 computer, and but the games were so good that it didn't matter, at least not to me. Um, but yeah, I mean, I owned that Atari 5200 for a very long time. I think all the way up until I moved out of Connecticut in 1993. It's either that, I think I gave it away. I don't remember now. But um, let's read a little information from Wikipedia about the 5200. Okay, the Atari 5200 Super System, that's what it was called back in the day, is a home video game console that was introduced in 1982 by Atari Incorporated as a higher-end complementary console for the popular Atari 2600. The 5200 was created to compete with the Intellivision, but wound up more directly competing with the ColecoVision shortly after its release. That's true. There was a little bit, I mean, it wasn't like Atari 2600 and television um, rivalry, so to speak, but yeah, there was a little bit of the Atari 5200 versus the ColecoVision. There's sort of a little bit of a rivalry there. The 5200's internal hardware is almost identical to that of Atari's 8-bit computers, and that is true, although software is not directly compatible between the two systems. The 5200's controllers have an analog joystick and a numeric keypad, along with start, pause, and reset buttons. The 360 non-centering joystick, 360 degree, let me get it right. The 360 degree non-centering joystick was touted as offering more control than the 8-way joystick controller offered with the Atari 2600. Or to me, yeah, but quite honestly, the controllers let this system down so bad it was not even funny. Um, on May 21st, 1984, during a press conference at which the Atari 7800 was introduced, company executives revealed that the 5200 had been discontinued after just 2 years on the market. Total sales of the 5200 were reportedly in excess of 1 million units. Yeah, the controllers. Let's see. Let's see. The initial 1982 release of the system featured 4 controller ports, where near all other systems of the day had only 1 or 2 ports. The 5200 featured a new style of controller with an analog joystick, numeric keypad, 2 fire buttons on each side of the controller, and game function keys for start, pause, and reset, which was actually pretty cool. That was one of the things that kind of set it apart from the other gaming systems, with the possible exception of the Intellivision. Um, the 5200 also featured the innovation of being the first automatic TV switch box, allowing it to automatically switch from regular TV viewing to the game system signal when the system was activated. Previous RF adapters required the user to slide a switch on the adapter by hand. The RF box was also where the power supply was connected in a unique dual power television signal setup similar to the RCA Studio 2. A single cable coming out of the 5200 plugged into the switch box and was used for both electricity and the television signal. See, I didn't know that, because I plugged mine in, at least for what I remember, I plugged mine in into an RF box. That's very interesting. But yeah, the controllers, which were basically the same as the ColecoVision controllers. The problem with them is that uh, the controls were a little sluggish. The joysticks were a little sluggish. The fire buttons weren't in a really good position for you to use them. Even of course you were using it, using the game using controller two-handed, but from what I remember, yeah, it made things really, really tough. Really, really tough to play. Um, but yeah, I mean, when I borrowed games from that, I borrowed like Robotron and Defender. I think my friend Damon had Congo Bongo for the 5200 and a couple other games, but that was the problem, is that The games were a little more expensive, and my mother seriously balked at buying them for me. And unfortunately, I wasn't quite old enough to get a job yet, so I was kind of stuck. Let's see. The 5200 did not fare well commercially compared to its predecessor, the 2600. While it touted superior graphics to the 2600 and Mattel's Intellivision, the system was initially incompatible with the 2600's expensive library of games, and some market analysts speculated that it hurted sales. I tend to agree. Especially since an Atari 2600 cartridge adapter had been released for the Intellivision too. A revised two-port model was released in 1983 along with a game adapter that allowed gamers to play all 2600 games. Now see, if they had done this in the beginning, the system, I think, would have seriously had more legs. But short-sightedness again, you know. Um, Many of the 5200 games appeared to simply be updated versions of 2600 titles, which failed to excite customers. Its packing game, Super Breakout, was criticized for not doing enough to demonstrate the system's capabilities, and this gave the ColecoVision a significant advantage once Pac-In Donkey Kong delivered a more authentic arcade experience than any previous game cartridge, and that is true. That is so true, and I'll talk about that when we get to this ColecoVision. As in its list of top 25 games consoles of all time, IGM claimed that the main reason for the 5200's market failure was the technological superiority of its competitor, while other sources maintained that the two consoles are roughly equivalent in power. The 5200 received much criticism for the sloppy design of its non-centering analog controllers. Anderson described the controllers as absolutely atrocious, and I tend to agree. That was probably the main thing that let it down. And the fact that it just wasn't, it should have been better than it was. It really should have, but unfortunately, it just wasn't. You know, it was just one of those games where, yeah, I got one in '83, and then it was gone. And that's pretty much that. You know, it just couldn't hold up under the popularity of the ColecoVision. It was the ColecoVision when it came out in '82. That was pretty much a wrap. Especially once they got the 2600 game adapter, which I'll get into again when we talk about the ColecoVision. But that's the 5200. I loved the games, but man, oh man, did those controllers let that system down. Seriously. And like was said, I remember the first generation of the 5200 having Super Breakout. That wasn't enough. I mean, they got their heads out of their backsides, and they actually got Pac-Man, which I think they should have gotten from the start. That would have helped them out immensely. But okay, that's the Atari 5200. And if you've got any questions, thoughts, comments, get a hold of me once again at arcadeaddictbrian, all one word, at gmail.com. And I think that's going to do it for now. Okay, so I'll let you guys know right now, we have a jam-packed show for episode 10. Uh, uh, I'm I'm looking at what I've got on my list here, and I'm just like, oh my God, what was I thinking? But I'm not going to change it. I'm going to put the show out as I put it down on my show notes file. So stay tuned for that. I'll give you a little taste. I'll be talking about the Video Connection. Top Tens comes back for 1983. There's a segment for story time coming up, and also we have a segment for time for some strategy. So we've got those four right in there. So stay tuned. As soon as I get this one out, I will certainly record episode 10 as soon as I can. So until next time, this is Brian. Have fun out there. Good gaming. Au revoir.
This has been the Confessions of an Arcade Addict podcast. All music is provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find his music at incompetech.com. If you wish to contact the show, you can drop an email at arcadeaddictryan, that's all one word, at gmail.com. We also have a voicemail number for the show. It is 734-743-2433. Until next time, this is the Confessions of an Arcade Addict podcast.